Eenvoud, strakke lijnen, veel glas. Modernistische architectuur wordt aan de Amerikaanse westkust al sinds de jaren 20 enthousiast omarmd.
The people that do come west, they are searching. And when they stop here, it's not just because there's a Pacific Ocean that stops you. I think that there is a place here that can really grab your heart and hold you.
One of the things about the West Coast, it draws people who have moved away from somewhere else as much as moving to a place.
Modernism grew out of a new freedom in architecture. That was based on a belief in progress.
I really feel that serious, good architecture will never die. It's just waiting for the time to come around again.
Modernism is a beautiful failure. You can't call it a success when 90% of people do not want to live in a modernist house.
Living here is a little like a dream. You definitely feel like you're part of nature in the middle of the city. Erickson did the landscape plan first, which is an interesting way to attack a house. How do you want to have a beautiful natural setting and then design the house? I mean, most people don't think that way. Coming into the house, you walk down a flight of steps to the entry. There's a pond down there. And it's the first sense of a water feature that kind of starts to settle you. And then you walk down the stairs here, and then you get the view of the gardens from this level. You're lifting away, you're leaving things on each level as you come in. Finally, at the end of your day, you walk down the final set of steps into the master suite. There you are, sitting amongst the bamboo and the lilies around the pond down there. And you let go. Our family, since we moved in here, we feel more physically healthy. You're inspired by that, just by living in the space. I think everybody appreciates that sense when you're standing in something that is beautiful and well thought out. Your life is better for that moment.
Architecture should provide spaces where you feel good, where you walk into a space and you feel relaxed, where it allows your mind to thrive, where it provides you an atmosphere where you can be creative or you can feel love. Good architecture can do that. So people think of modernism as a style, much like Craftsman or Spanish. Unlike those styles where there's a limited set of materials, of moves, of details. It's almost like a rule book. Modernism doesn't really have those constraints because it's actually not a style. It's a way of thinking. It's a way of reinventing and abstracting. And so it's much more open-ended.
My experience with our clients and the feedback I've had from them living in the buildings we've done, they're very surprised at how it actually has transformed and enhanced their lives. It's not something that you would get right away, but I think in living in the homes, there's a joy that comes from the buildings. It's that fluidity of space and the way it blurs the boundaries between the inside and the outside. Traditional houses were more about enclosure, and I think that a modernist house is about expanding into the environment. Another thing about a modernist house is it's a different type of living. There's a more open concept to the plan because the idea of living is much more fluid, I think, than the separated rooms of a typical traditional house. And another distinction is an expression of materials and how they create structure. You're seeing the material. That doesn't mean it has to be in its raw form. It can have a craftsman's detail on it, but it's much more expressive of the structure.
Maybe the most famous house in the world is Fallingwater, obviously Frank Lloyd Wright. Wright was considered the best architect of our times. And then there's Villa Savoy, Corbusier. I mean, you can't imagine two more different pieces of architecture. One of them is a celebration of nature, natural materials, and the other one is elevated up so it doesn't touch the ground visibly. It's a totally different idea.
If you look at the architecture of Le Corbusier, there's a more urban and more refined aspect to that architecture. If you look at the architecture of Frank Lloyd Wright, he developed the modern organic architecture, and that, I think, is part of the pioneer spirit of being in North America, always doing the first building in a place as opposed to building upon something that's already been there. And building in nature and being surrounded by nature. And the way in North America we are still surrounded by nature. The environment we grow up in and that we live in really does affect our ways of understanding and relating to space, which then goes into the architecture that we build.
I think it starts really with spending time with clients to learn about what's important to them. Not just the pragmatics of, a study here and a room that's of a certain size, but what do they care about? What are their hopes and dreams and so on? And you try and get a sense of what these people are all about. One of the characteristics of modernism is that it has a level of abstraction to it. That allows for a kind of timeless quality, but it also allows the designer more flexibility in composing a space like this room. You're not bound by the rules of symmetry and axial alignment or a particular language of architecture. One of the things we look to do is to articulate a deeper connection to the landscape. Laying out this wing of the house, we wanted it to be laid out exactly north, south, east, west. We have this standing seam metal roofing. When you're standing in the courtyard in the south, you could sight up along those ribs of the roof and know that that was absolutely true north. So then when you're looking at the stars or something, you can see it's a kind of built-in compass. So things like that allow the house to really, anchor you in the landscape and in the region. So the house becomes a kind of instrument for locating you in your universe.
Space and the way it's created is a part of the modernist theory from the beginning. The way that you organize space, the way you choreograph the experience of that space, the circulation through the space from the beginning of the front door until you ended up in the final denouement of the building. The structure of the space, the light, the audible quality, the tactile quality, the materials that were used, the way they changed. All of this was intended to create in the person a sensation, or a series of sensations that by the time they experienced them would improve their condition. If a building was designed for a user over time, the idea was that their actual life would change as they experienced that space every day in their lives. And we have this experience with modern buildings. You go into them and they are a space in time outside the usual experience. The best of them create this sensation where you feel like, my God, this is amazing. I want to live here, I want to stay here, I don't want to leave.
I try to always save every tree that's on a site and build around it and use it as one of the design elements. If you're a person who really enjoys nature, enjoys seeing what the sun does all day long as it moves through a house and you see the shadows change and the light change and you go on into the night and then you get the moonlight, you're so much closer to the reality of what the world's about.
There's a difference between architecture and just building. 99% of the work out there is done by builders, contractors, whatever. But art is in architecture. Architecture is an art as much as a science. The scientific part of it is making sure it stands up and that it functions and all the rest of it. But in the end of the day, a good piece of architecture is a habitable work of art. It's something that you can feel uplifted by. You feel different when you leave it. You feel transformed by it. I call it the washing machine theory of architecture. You come into the washing machine, this dirty, unwashed, illiterate, ignorant person. You're experiencing this space, and it cleans you and it cleanses you, and changes your spirituality, and you leave all bright and shiny and new. And that was the modern idea.
Modernism had some really surprising and unexpected effects. It reacted to a Europe overgrown with ornament, with fussy detail, rooms layered with fabrics and wallpaper and fussy furniture. The Modernists came along and stage by stage, level by level, stripped it away. And you would think that would make these places less livable, but in blessed zones, like the western coast of North America, that stripping away made it better and better and better. That's the kind of bottom line of modernism.
The human race lived in nature for the first 1.5 million years or more of its existence. Only recently, in the last 10,000 years or so, we got the idea of creating a shelter, either a cave or a tent or some way to close yourself off from nature. Most of those experiments, the earlier ones, were not very successful because it created a barrier between you and nature, and you begin to feel closed in or claustrophobic or cut off. Only in the last few hundred years, when we've had glass, have we been able to create shelter, but still maintain contact with the outside. There's plenty of precedents to talk about what happens if you don't follow that. For a while, people were building office buildings with no windows, and then finding out that people are going to the doctor more often and getting sick and wondering why, and that's why. We're not built that way. We're not set up for that.
Richard Neutra became one of America's most important architects of modernism in the 20th century. Neutra was self-taught in evolutionary biology. He makes no apologies for the straight line. He understood that plumb and level is part of us, and understanding the straightness of gravity. So we have this idea of plumb. We evolved on the savannas of East Africa. We have built into our cognitive and neural systems, our visual systems, this idea of the horizon line. To see the horizon line, it makes us feel secure. You are always an animal. You have needs for prospect and refuge, and they're very human instincts. We want to see if there's anything out there we can eat or kill or mate with, and then we also need a cave. And one of the most profound functions of architecture is to provide shelter in this increasingly chaotic and increasingly incoherent environment.
Schindler was a modern architect, but he was so original that he called his own architecture space architecture rather than modern architecture. He rejected the notion that architecture should be based on new methods of construction. Schindler said, reinforced concrete and steel actually free the architect to design in any way he likes. In other words, you're no longer limited by structure. Instead, the architect will design with space, climate, light, and mood. He was primarily interested in how those affected interior space. The Kingsward House was this really radical idea. 2 couples lived there. Each adult had their own studio for living and working in. The idea of normal living was really pushed in the background. Every studio had its own fireplace, and you're supposed to be able to cook in the fireplace, just like as if you were camping. A minimum enclosure connected to the outside as much as possible, sometimes literally through, sliding doors, so that you really do feel connected with this, incredible, mild Southern California climate.
The interesting thing about Rudolf Schindler is that he felt architecture could create new ideas about how to live, that we can change as individuals and as a society, and we can even do it through the buildings and how we make them and how we situate them, and aesthetics can change the way we think.
The Pacific Northwest was more insular in a way. It wasn't in the thick of it. You know, when Stravinsky emigrated to the United States, he didn't go to Portland, you know. He went to LA. All these people went to LA. I think partly the lure of Hollywood is there, partly because of its glitz, but also because of money. I mean, there were jobs available directly and indirectly from the film industry, which places like Portland, Seattle just didn't have. They were much more provincial places, and were cautious about just receiving the full box, you know, that came in the mail. Oh, here's modernism, we'll just like take it as it is. Now I'm a modernist. They didn't want to do that. So I think that happened with the Pacific Northwest, and it happened with the West Coast above LA. John Yon here in Portland was a kind of anti-architect architect. Yon was integrating vernacular traditions of the region, mostly agrarian buildings, into modernism. The Watzek House, which was built for a very wealthy, prominent Portland business person, socialite, who would normally have a sort of Greek mansion or a French mansion or, you know, something quite splashy. Jan conceived this house for him, which Watzek's friends used to refer to as the chicken shack. And they rib him about it because, you know, it's like, what is this house? This is, you know, you spent all this money on this place, it looks like a barn. But it's a very mild-mannered house. You come to it, and it is almost a kind of nothing place. You could drive by it very easily. But you go through, and there are things about this house that are extraordinary. One is the integration with the landscape. Another is this weaving together of modern space and what you might call old-fashioned or traditional space. And so, you know, you go through, there's this fabulous, fabulous courtyard that he developed with indoor-outdoor living, which is as wonderful as anything Neutra or any of those people ever did. It's just a, you know, you open this courtyard door through this walled compound, and your body just kind of goes, wow, look at this.
It's really about the principles that Jan used. Not so much the shapes or the forms, but really the combination of a kind of more classical ordering system with a more modern spatial organizing system. And in the Watzek House, he combines both. That is extraordinarily difficult to do in a way that is seamless, and it's seamless at the Watzek House. The living room, you know, which has this old kind of English coffered ceiling, and yet it's not a classical room, it's actually asymmetrical. And yet it's all worked out. There's no funny transitions or awkward moments. And that's a real feat from a design standpoint. That's why it's so important. I've been there a dozen times, and every time I go there, I learn something new. It's just an extraordinary house.
In the 1920s and 30s on the west coast of North America, there were a few really fascinating and provocative projects that really captured many of the ideals and aspirations of modernism. And then with the Depression and World War II, the promises of those projects were really put on the sidelines. And it wasn't until the end of the war and with the return of the troops and the housing boom that ensued that many of those ideas kind of returned. So it's really in that context that John Entenza, the editor of Arts and Architecture magazine, dreamed up the case study house program. He selected certain important architects of the era to design prototypical homes that were meant to be highly economical, affordable, and efficient. These designs were published in his magazine, and then some of the homes were actually built to really demonstrate what the kind of modern theories really meant. One of the most exciting case study homes is case study number 22, designed by Pierre Koenig. Part of the power of the home is the way in which it was photographed, and it's really those photos that have proven to be some of the most powerful images of modern domestic architecture.
Aside from Falling Water, Case Study House 22 is probably the most photographed house in the world. And yet, Case Study House 21 was his favorite. It's just a little gem. It's a small house. It's 1,300 square feet, which is like a closet in some of the mansions that we see these days. And yet, it's so open and so beautifully planned. He felt that such slender buildings require steel instead of wood. And he felt that steel housing could work for the masses. It just never happened. This was just not something people were ready for.
If you take a look at the Case Study House program, it had some momentum and then it sort of died. I think there was a real lack of interest by the general public that was a little cautious about these new objects that came onto the scene. And for whatever reason, the following was, I think, relatively small in comparison to the traditional home.
If you look at a post-war period, the baby boom, the return from World War II, the veterans coming back, that was a critical moment in architecture because architects at that point could have stepped in and actually rolled up their sleeves and started getting involved in that reality. They didn't do that. Why didn't they do that? I know in the United States, there was this disdain for the public sector that was engendered by professional institutions. And a lot of architects looked at it as something they didn't want to dirty their hands with. And so the developers saw a vacuum. The developer homes out there were a direct response to a need, but they certainly aren't a good example of great design. So there was this rift between what you might call good design and design for the masses for the suburban need. There are examples in the modernist period of developers and architects working together to create developer homes that have a good aesthetic. There were developers who were enlightened, but they're very few and far between, and they didn't really have a national impact. They had a very localized impact.
Joe Eichler himself had lived in a Frank Lloyd Wright house, and he wanted to bring housing to the masses. He felt they should all have the opportunity to live like he was living. These were small houses, very lightly built. They were sheathed mostly in 1/4-inch plywood everywhere, but with this great interaction between indoor and outdoor and very simple spaces, open plan. They were very nice houses and very well appreciated and still are today.
Post-1945 magazines were really largely invested in endorsing modern architecture. They really believed that was a response for the post-war society. This kind of architecture was advertised as a lifestyle for the masses, not for the elite society. You didn't need to have a a wealthy patron to be able to have a modern house.
I remember my parents, they're from back east. They couldn't wait to get out here and just get rid of anything that was old. They wanted Danish modern furniture. They wanted that clean silverware that didn't have all the gorp and curlicues on it. I think what appealed to my parents was the absence of history. They liked the fact that it allowed you to somehow start your life new in a very positive way. And what happened is, as you went up the coast, you had large chunks of land, which were large comparative to what was available back east. So you could be a bit more expansive in what you built and how you experimented.
Sea Ranch was designed as a recreation community. It was significant because it was a totally different architecture. We hadn't seen buildings like this. Simple timber objects that were responding very much to where they were and the weather patterns, extreme coastal climate. It's windy all the time. It's stunningly beautiful, but it still is a really difficult climate to both build in and to live in. All the buildings really were deferential to the landscape, shaped so that they fit into hollows or hid behind little rows of trees. The roof eaves were all clipped back to the wall lines. That developed a real aesthetic of that place. This became something that was suddenly an international phenomenon.
The influence of Sea Ranch can be traced all the way up and down the coast. But the form and materials that were very much in response to the natural landscape, again, challenged prevailing and preconceived ideas about what a home should or shouldn't be.
This land nobody could use because of the creeks, and how do you build on a cliff? Nobody knew how to do that or was interested. And I think they were seriously doing this partially because of the idealism of generating some decent architecture. They wanted to build interesting housing in the woods, but the neighbors freaked. These crazies building this amazing enclave. Contractors couldn't read the plans. There was nothing ordinary about them and nothing easy. You had to have a builder who was a craftsman who could figure out what this meant and how to build it. So I think they were expensive, and only very particular people got this. I mean, these were weird houses because they were certainly not ordinary. A whole lot of angles, not family convenient, not in the traditional sense. I mean, we had lots of friends say, have you lost your mind? I'm like, what is this? We had families say, well, oh my God, they've made a mistake. All the boards are inside out because there's all this crappy stuff on the outside of them. And what are you going to paint the walls? So these were not houses that people were lining up to buy. It was kind of a moment in time, and not enough people love this stuff.
I cannot tell you how many times I would get a call saying, well, come look at my house. I wouldn't even need the street address because it was so obvious which house was the house I was going to write about on a block. And neighbors would say, oh, that spaceship? You mean the spaceship? I'll always describe it as something foreign, something different. And the famous industrial designer Raymond Loewy talks about Maya, most advanced yet acceptable, and says that in every generation, you can push only so far. But then when you go a little bit further, you've gone too far. You can't take people so far out of their comfort zone that they refuse to accept what it is that you're offering them.
There just is this psychology of the human being that has archetypal associations with home. So if you give a kid, a 5-year-old, a piece of paper and a pencil, say, draw your house. They're probably not going to draw a big box with a great big sliding door in it full of glass, and say, hey, there's my, it's just space, man. He's not going to do that. He's going to draw a little thing on top. He's going to draw a little window. And there is this sense that a house has that home quality to it, and that home involves pitched roofs.
Maybe the modernists forgot that there's other primal instincts that aren't rational, such as the need to feel in darkness, even though to be in daylight may be logical. Sometimes I think we need to separate our spaces, that even if it's logical to have Neutra's indoor-outdoor schemes or flex spaces, I think people may have a primal need to have spaces separately defined.
By really the 1960s, corporate entities, institutional entities had so thoroughly embraced modernism. So the places people were working in, the places where they were traveling through, the places they were going to school in, began to be associated with institutionality. And these associations kind of ironically in some ways produced a backlash when it came to domestic space, because domestic space was seen or desired to be a retreat from the daily slog of the workplace, of the institution. So it should feel and operate differently. And I think that's one of the major aspects for why modernism wasn't more successful at the scale of the domestic house.
Part of the 20th century condition is addiction to novelty. And I think that what happened was these houses were being made and then the novelty wore off. In the same way that fashion in the 60s were one way, in the 70s they went another way. But then the 80s came and ugh. It was McMansions and monster houses and stucco. People just started making houses just crazy big. They looked at the zoning laws and said, hey, we can put 10 times more house here than we actually have. And I think the greed of that decade is expressed through its architecture.
The 80s was the beginning of new, faster, cheaper, flimsier materials, but all being used to kind of produce visions of what one thought of the past. So it's this mixture of kind of plastic quickness and history that produced strange architecture and ideas about living.
There's houses like this one we're in right now, which was built in 1958, and it has the distinction of not having been torn down. It's like that. It somehow escaped. What saved the remains of modern architecture in the West Coast was sort of like the wallpaper magazine revival that happened in the 90s. I think people looked at things like even simple stuff like Eames chairs and went, wow, these are kind of like sculpture you can sit on. I just had a whole new generation of people looking at this stuff and appreciating it. For my parents, it was an escape from the past and a way of looking at the future. And for people my age and younger, it's a way of looking at the past.
One of the ironies, in a way, is that there's been a resurgence of interest in modern design. But by the same token, I think the design process itself is less well understood. If you think about the architectural press, for example, that is giving you these little sound bites of design, these little bits and pieces. So as a result, you can't go very deep. that's one of the things that a lot of my colleagues struggle with.
There's always this aspect of modernism as a style representing what you might call a hipster mentality. And that's where I'm not happy about its magazine stylization, as it were, because it's, you know, if you look through the pictures, it's the same couple. It's the same couple sitting on the same couch, and they're buying the same furniture from the same store.
I think that there was just sort of a perfect storm of things happening in, say, the late 90s, early 2000s, where there was all this talk about the democratization of design, and that design was going to change the world, and that it could provide you with a great quality of life. And this was about the same time that the dot-com boom was happening, and the future in technology was sort of top of mind, and people got really excited about it. Modernism seemed to speak to a new population, a new group of people interested in something that the marketplace wasn't offering them in the way of design goods and homes. And so the promise definitely seemed there. I think what happened, though, is that for all the excitement around what modern design and modern architecture could do, what it could do is give you a nice place to live. So I guess a disappointment for me in modernism is that it did become about acquisition and just sort of showing this wonderful house that you had, as opposed to maybe some of the earlier ideals of modernism.
I think the most deadly syndrome these days is preciousness. Things are a little too clean, a little too nice, a little too buffed. It's almost like the only permissible bodies are perfect bodies, and that everything else is a failure. Well, we've got a lot of aerobically shaped houses these days. They spend a lot of time in the gym. They pump supplements like crazy, but they're heartless. They have no character. You walk through them and you can't remember where you are. They can be anywhere and everywhere. But there are houses out there that are really, really exciting and keep the spirit going. The house in a concrete block and the Los Angeles hills, the kind of self-build, make it happen, a little bit rough around the edges.
I think one of the things about modernism is whatever the materials are and the availabilities of materials and the techniques of the day are the ones to embrace and to do it efficiently and effectively. There's a tendency to overdo stuff. The thing that's really interesting about building this house is that to save money, I did a lot of stuff myself, and I'm not a builder, and it's very humbling because there are many mistakes. And what's really great about having this house be concrete is it doesn't get warm. I mean, the concrete stays cool in the warmest weather, and you get a cross ventilation, and it's just so comfortable. There's no air conditioning. None is needed. The other idea is that you maintain a narrow footprint. This house is 14 feet clear on the inside, 15.4 on the outside. On a 50-foot lot, that gives you a larger garden for growing things, for helping water to get into the aquifer. So it's really sustainable in many ways. Any kind of example of modernism, you should be able to sort of see it as a potential typology that, when repeated, could actually make an amazing city. So imagine like a neighborhood, or even imagine this building extruded 10 stories, where like each one of these was a flat. You know, that's one of my next jobs.
Most of us try to do too much with our spaces and our environment. We're living in a situation of over-stylization and over-consumption. If we could pull back and live with less things and live with an idea of purity about how we live, people can start to appreciate what they have around them without having to go out to continually purchase things. I always like things that change. I always like things that age gracefully. It's in Japanese, it's wabi-sabi. It's that sort of contrast between the polished and the worn that I think adds texture and actually adds beauty to the whole composition. The final act for me in terms of architecture would be to try to create the ultimate living situation that depends on nothing more than the basics of what you need. This is very, very difficult because you have to remove all the baggage that you've carried from childhood. But I think if you can eliminate and live in a very, very simple way, I think it'd be amazing, actually gaining more of your life.
Most of my colleagues, relatives said that the house was not salvageable. I don't know how many times I heard, "It's a tear down, Pratt. You can't save it."
The existing house on the lot was designed by my father, architect Ned Pratt. It was leaking, there was a lot of rot, and the challenge was, what can I save? After taking most of it down, there's only 1,400 square feet left. I wanted to have some continuity. This is where I grew up. That's part of the history, especially given that my dad was an architect. Got to save the old house, and at the same time, we got to build my place. There's a linking up of generations. There's this symbiotic conversation happening. In my mind, they complement each other, though they're different. Different influences, different era, different technology. If you look at this house, even though this is less than 1,200 square feet, it seems really quite large and expansive. I could have sold this and moved on with something else, but something always drew me back.
I mean, this is our home. It's not so much an asset, it's our home. It'll be passed on to my children and their children, hopefully. It's not something that's going to be sold in a couple of years for a profit. This is where we want to live. This is our place. It has a sense of place, and this is our place.
Good architecture opens up possibilities, makes life richer and deeper, makes you think about wood in a new way, gets you to second guess concrete and realize how warm it can be, reveals aspects of nature you never noticed. Ask your question, is my life better or more richer for this? Did I get a little pleasure there just walking through a doorway? Those are always the signs of good architecture. The key thing is live through architecture, not for it.
Come so far, feel so real. All this time I've been waiting for it. Who